Hello and welcome to Debate Clash. In this video, we'll be going over the new public forum debate topic for November. This video will first go over the background information that you need to debate this topic after finally looking at some of the major arguments presented on both sides of the debate. The public forum debate resolution that's seemingly ripped straight from the headlines is resolved. In response to the current crisis, a government should prioritize the humanitarian needs of refugees over its national interests. The current crisis that the resolution is talking about is the European refugee crisis. Millions of people are being forced to leave their friends, families, and homes behind in search for a better life. These refugees are coming from Afghanistan, Somalia, Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and many other countries. However, the biggest and most talked about country that they're coming from is Syria. The YouTube series In a Nutshell gives a great explanation as to why this is.
Syria is located in the Middle East, an ancient, fertile land settled for at least 10,000 years. Since the 1960s, it's been led by the al-Assad family, who have ruled it as quasi-dictators until the Arab Spring happened in 2011, a revolutionary wave of protests and conflicts in the Arab world that toppled many authoritarian regimes. But the Assads refused to step down and started a brutal civil war. Different ethnicities and religious groups fought each other in changing coalitions. ISIS, a militaristic jihadist group, used the opportunity and entered the chaos with the goal to build a totalitarian Islamic caliphate. Very quickly, it became one of the most violent and successful extremist organizations on earth.
The Syrian people found themselves stuck in between an aggressive dictator and several violent extremist organizations. Instead of staying in this horrible situation, millions have decided to flee their country out of a sheer act of desperation. Yahoo News reports where these Syrian refugees are fleeing to.
4 million people have already fled, and thousands more are leaving every single day. In fact, here's a look at where they're all going. And this is putting a tremendous economic and political strain on all these nations.
When you have a constant stream of hundreds of thousands and even millions of people coming into your country with nothing more than the clothes on their back, you're going to face those social, political, and economic issues that Yahoo is talking about. Economically, because you as a country are now in charge of feeding them, clothing them, giving them shelter, water, make sure they have access to healthcare, all at the same time as maintaining your own country. And politically, this raises several other questions. Do we take them in? Do we kick them out? Are other countries going to let them in? Or are the other international organizations going to come in and save the day? Jordan's Minister of Planning and International Cooperation explains some of the effects that this refugee crisis has placed on his own country.
Education and health has been really thinly stretched to the maximum. Water sector has been, Jordan is a country in their need for water, and it has been really affected by the fact that there is this extra almost 1 million Syrians now residing in Jordan. That is speaking of the direct impact, but also Jordan has lost a lot of trade activities with Syria, the transit industry. And we have to keep in mind the investment climate, the tourism and other sector that is indirectly affected by the influx of the Syrians and the overall turbulence in the region.
This scratches the surface as to the problems that these nations are having. And these problems aren't just unique to Jordan, nor are refugees only streaming from Syria. The resolution then poses the question, does a government prioritize the humanitarian needs of these refugees over its own national interests? This analysis will first start by going over what you should be defining in the resolution, and then moving on to the main affirmative and negative arguments. The first phrase in the resolution that I would be defining is current crisis. What is the scope of the debate? Can we talk about South American refugees, just the European crisis, just the Middle Eastern crisis? Maybe this is exclusive to Syria. Define what current crisis is and give several reasons as to why this is what the scope of the debate should be. The next definition that's even more crucial to define is this word prioritize. Does this mean that the government can only take care of the refugees or its national interests? Is it when the two are in conflict? Make sure you're defining this at the very beginning of the round to avoid he said, she said arguments later on. I might also define national interests versus humanitarian aid and give a couple examples. The more clarification on this topic, the better. The main arguments that you'll be seeing in November will focus around four main categories: philosophical, extremist arguments, instability arguments, and finally emotional arguments. Let's move on to the philosophical side of the affirmative debate. Most public forum debaters don't know how to run philosophy, meaning if you know how, you're going to have a massive advantage. The first philosophical argument you'll likely see is the debate around utilitarianism, or as you've probably heard it, greatest good for the greatest amount of people. If you're looking into these type of arguments, one of the philosophers that you should read up on is Peter Singer. He gives a great explanation as to when a country should not help. In this case, he would basically argue that as long as your country doesn't fully collapse, that you should still help these refugees out. The next argument that you can look into is the categorical imperative by Kant. If you don't know what these are, you definitely need to look up Kant and his categorical imperatives, because your opponents will likely be running them. The next argument that you likely won't be seeing very much, but that you're very welcome to run, is that borders are inherently immoral, or that they shouldn't exist, that we created them as a society. And just because I won the birth lottery and was born in a stable country doesn't mean that I deserve any more right to a better quality of life than someone in Syria who happened to get sucked into that instability. The next philosopher that you can look into is Leslie Green from the University of Oxford. She actually writes literature specifically about the Syrian refugee crisis and what countries should do. And finally, any philosophers that talk about life or the quality of life or how we're all equal, any of these philosophers will most likely relate to the affirmative strategy. Make sure if you're running any of these philosophical arguments that you're running them right. Make sure that the judge is okay with philosophical arguments, and make sure that they'll actually vote on them before you run these type of arguments. Also make sure that you do a lot of work in the framework of the debate or the resolutional analysis to make sure that these arguments don't just get pushed to the side. The second major category that you'll see affirmative arguments surrounded is instability. These refugees essentially offer two alternatives. The first is we take them in, we clothe them, we feed them, we give them health care, maybe we even give them a job. We help them get back on their feet and stabilize our economy, the country that accepted them in, and essentially the Middle East. The second alternative is that we kick them out, we don't give them anything, we let them die while trying to cross the sea. That doesn't stabilize the Middle East, that doesn't stabilize my country, because there's still chaos within the Middle East. These refugees are still trying to get into the country, and inevitably probably will. If we take care of these refugees, then we also take care of our national interests. This is a perfect example of a root cause argument, and that's why I think that this argument is fantastic. If you can prove the links, if you can prove that a country accepts refugees in, and that accepting the refugees and helping them will help stabilize the Middle East, you have access to a world of impacts. Anything stemming from terrorism, anything stemming from oil, Middle Eastern instability, even the European economy, any of these arguments you can get access to if you have the right links. The third category that you'll see a lot of people making arguments around on the affirmative is extremist or extremist organizations. A lot of people will run the argument that if nobody helps these people out, these refugees, that they'll likely just join terrorist organizations and bomb the host countries that wouldn't let them in the first place. Although this argument is very enticing because it has a large impact, I don't think that the links are fully there. Most of these refugees are actually running away from ISIS or from these extremist organizations. They don't want to join them, and that's why they're getting out of their country. Now, I think the other way that people will run this argument, which is probably a little bit better, stronger links but less of an impact, is they'll run this by saying that petty crime, or just crime in general, will increase. Take, for example, a nation that accepts 1 million immigrants, 1 million refugees into their country, and then they don't provide humanitarian aid to them. They prioritize national interests over the humanitarian aid. Those refugees may have to resort to stealing, to hurting other individuals, or doing something in some way that would be bad. I think this is probably the stronger argument, that we need to prioritize humanitarian aid once these refugees get into the country to prevent petty crime from increasing. The links are there. The impacts may be not so strong, but if you can create the impacts to be stronger, then by all means, go for it. The fourth category of arguments is arguments that you'll likely be seeing, but that I personally wouldn't run. Anyone that's followed the news or this crisis at all will know that people are dying, people are being tortured. Everyone knows about the image of that little boy that washed up on the shore because he was trying to escape his country and didn't make it. If you get the right judge, you can play these emotional arguments off like none other. They're personally not my format or style that I like to run, but if you get the right judge, these arguments can go quite far. The negative also has 4 major foundations of arguments. Firstly, the economy, then extremism, philosophical arguments, and finally the workarounds. Now, going over the negative economic arguments, there are so many links to the economy that the negative has that it's hard to conceive. The first one that you'll likely be seeing a lot is just the sheer billions of dollars that are going to be spent on humanitarian aid to these refugees. A lot of people will argue that this could collapse the economy. If you're going to run this, make sure that you have strong links as to how that deficit or debt would likely be hurting the economy. But the second argument that you'll likely be seeing a lot is consumer and business confidence. I feel like this argument has a very, very strong foundation. If a lot of refugees are coming into my country and I'm a business owner and we're spending billions of dollars into helping them out, me personally, I don't want to invest in other places. As a consumer, I might want to save some money just in case things get worse. And essentially, the art of consumer and business confidence is that it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. As soon as you think that the economy is going to collapse, it does, because we change our spending habits and investment habits. Another link that the negative has to the economy is supply and demand of basic necessities. Supply is going to remain relatively the same for basic necessities, whereas if you have millions of refugees coming into your country, the demand is greatly going to increase. This generally causes price hikes, which can affect the economy in a variety of ways. There are also several other economic links that the negative can use for their case. The second category that negative arguments will filter into is extremism. There have been several allegations that a lot of extremist organizations are disguising themselves as refugees and coming into a hosting country. The negative could then propose that instead of prioritizing humanitarian aid and letting anyone in, that we could potentially have a screening process, or even that we could halt the aid to anyone that has committed a crime against that nation or stolen anything. There are several ways that you could prioritize national interests over humanitarian aid in order to protect your own assets or your own country. Another argument that you'll see is that we should spend more money fighting terrorism and stabilizing these countries that the refugees are running away from, that this will prevent future spillover, that it will decrease terrorism. I think this argument has a lot of potential, very strong impacts, and if you can provide the links, it's going to be a fantastic argument. The third category for the negative is philosophical arguments. Although the affirmative has a lot of arguments that they can make regarding philosophy, the negative also has some firepower. The first way that they do is the social contract. As a lot of people know, we give up rights as citizens for the government to protect us. So the government should prioritizing us, or national interests, over the refugees and the humanitarian aid we provide them. Another way you can argue this is the duty or the purpose of the government. There is a lot of literature out there that says that the government was created to protect its citizens, that every single government, no matter what country you belong to, was designed to protect its national interests and its citizens. There's some literature on this by a biologist named Garrett Hardin, who wrote a paper titled Lifeboat Ethics. In this paper, he essentially said that if we're on a lifeboat due to a shipwreck, we can't let everyone that was on a ship onto our small little boat. If we do, that lifeboat will sink and all of us will drown. I think this concept can definitely be applied to the resolution in that accepting more refugees into our country could destabilize us and cause more chaos for everyone. The final category for the negative is workarounds. Essentially, these are word plays with the resolution that the negative can turn to their advantage. The first one that we look at is that we can still give aid to the refugees. Make sure that your judge knows that the word prioritize doesn't mean we choose national interests or refugees, that we can do both, but if they're in conflict, we choose national interests and take care of our own citizens. I think the negative can definitely play this very well. The second argument that the negative can play off of in this category is non-governmental organizations, or NGOs. The negative can argue that a government's responsibility is to protect its national interests. However, non-governmental organizations like the United Nations or NATO, their duty is to provide humanitarian aid, and that this country can give money to the United Nations to take care of the refugees, but that country as a whole should prioritize the humanitarian needs of its citizens or its own national interests. I think you can also make the argument to get offense by saying that multilateralism with humanitarian aid works better than unilateralism. That by going through these organizations, that it's going to turn out better for the refugees as well. The negative can also work around the words current crisis in the resolution. The negative can say that right now, in the present time, we don't need to prioritize humanitarian aid over national interests. However, in the future, in a future crisis, we might have to prioritize humanitarian aid. But we're not talking about that. We're talking about the current crisis, and right now, it's not bad enough to prove that. The negative has a lot of workarounds that can definitely help them win. There are a couple tips that I suggest using in this November resolution. The first one is that clarification is key. The absolute worst thing that can happen for me as a judge is to see the affirmative present a definition of prioritize, the negative define prioritize a different way, and have those not clash. So at the end of the round, me as a judge gets to decide who wins based on which definition I liked better. Make sure that you're clashing with the definitions and that you're clarifying everything. The first cross-X is going to be your sanctuary. Make sure you define national interests, humanitarian aid, the word prioritize, maybe what current crisis means. If you can agree with your opponents on all these things, maybe come to a middle ground, then you can actually develop into a good debate. You can define what you're defending, what you're attacking, and it will help everyone in the round just have a better debate. The second tip is short and sweet. The resolution is not US specific. It says a government should prioritize, not the US government. The third tip I have for you is to understand the topic and watch your words. This topic is imperfectly set up for someone to say some very racist or offensive remarks. Read some stories, read some blogs, watch videos about these refugees and the horrible things they're going through. Build some empathy and treat them like they are. They are individuals. Please don't say anything racist. Not only will it look bad on you, but the judge will instantly vote you down as well.